We're going to talk about something that came on the BBC last week about how politics has become nasty. Has it? Let's have a just think about this. The type of language that we use day in, day out towards one another, it's changed over many, many years. Where we would disagree with one another, and the language we would use would be passionate but respectful. You look at the way in which people blaming social media for the ills of all our society. It's a little bit unfair in that, for instance, Twitter, you've got 140 characters in which to express yourself. And some people just do not know how to express themselves in that way. Some do, and they are very acerbic and can be witty, but they can also be very, very misogynistic and threatening and very, very unpleasant, especially towards women. So what we're going to try and do here is look at this clip and just see how the argument goes backwards and forwards. And you've only got to look at the representation of two different parts of the political spectrum. We have the left and we have the right and we have the centre. And of course people like to parade the left as far left and the right as far right. And there's this chunk in the centre which people feel comfortable with, or seem to agree that that is the correct way of expressing yourselves. But when we put passion into the equation, you don't meet many passionate centrists. They seem to be people who want the status quo, things to remain the same as it always has been and always wants to be so for ever and ever. Whereas the far right want to change things so radically that they become obsessive with a free market approach, no local government, getting rid of regulations, and just basically being a free-for-all for everyone. Then you've got the far left, which oppose all those things. They want more regulation. They want to see more regulation so that companies don't abuse their workforce. That they are against capitalism with a big C. And they, like the far right, have a tendency to go to extremes. But which one do you think would be the most appropriate one to sort of hitch your wagon to? And it's got me thinking about how we look at the language which is used, not only in let's say, social media and on TV, but in papers. I remember many, many years ago doing a social science course, and there was this snippet in the paper about in the coursework that shows the differences in interpretation that a newspaper made over two different events. You had a group of youngsters, they were football hooligans, and quite rightly they were portrayed as hooligans because of the damage they caused. But in the same newspaper we had an instance where we had some public school boys that damaged property, were vocal, were abusive, and that was classed as hijinks. The two are exactly the same in that they both caused damage, they both caused physical damage as well. They were both abusive, but the way in which each of those was treated in the press was so different. And I'm always of the belief that you should call things out for what they are. I don't believe that a particular sector of the community should be treated differently because they come from a privileged background. And this is part and parcel of the way in which our media looks at things. And the media basically is controlled by right-wing proprietors. Yes, there's the Daily Mirror and the Guardian, but predominantly the UK press is right-wing. And you can have an argument about whether or not you feel the Guardian is getting to the point where it is not centre-left anymore, but moving centre-right. And I think that, from my personal opinion, I believe that it is moving that way. And that's a sad reflection on our society that a once great newspaper is having to do that. On the other side, and then on the left-hand side, you've still got the Mirror. And I can't call the Mirror a serious newspaper anymore. I can remember, I'm old enough to remember when it did actual proper investigative journalism. And those days have long gone for the Mirror. The Independent is really not that independent. And then you've got the Times and the Mail and the Express and the Telegraph, which all are part of the right-wing agenda in this country. You may have the odd columnist in all those papers that is not part of that right-wing agenda, but they're very few and far between. And then you look upon things like the radio, and you've got LBC, and you've got Talk Radio, and of course you've got the BBC. None of them really are prepared to go out on a limb to tell things as they really are. The BBC has been politicised by Cameron when he became Prime Minister. The BBC has always been conservative with a small c in its approach to things. But in the past, you did have proper investigative journalism. You did feel that, yes, there may be that behind it, but they were always prepared to put the other point of view. And over the years, that view of impartiality and that education, certainly within the politics and news part of the BBC, is diminished to an extent now that I don't think a lot of people can actually trust that part of the BBC anymore. And LBC and Talk Radio, they are what they are. You know, you've got Julia Hartley-Brewer on Talk Radio. You've got Nick Ferrari on LBC. You know, there's no way that you can take those two individuals and say they are representative of the bulk of the British people. So we're looking at this clip and it's talking about how things are portrayed. And whether you loathe Jeremy Corbyn or admire Jeremy Corbyn, the one thing you can say about him is that he is principled. And the way in which media people from the left and the right, or centre left should I say, and right, have actually tried to diminish his influence and attack him for his principles. It's quite appalling, really. The man actually voted against the Iraq War. He was right to do so. He has been right on every big political decision this country has ever made. When in Parliament, we have the likes of Hilary Benn, who wanted to go to war in Syria. And the language which has been used, even for people within his own party, such as Margaret Hodge and Wes Streeting and Tom Watson, it's been utterly appalling. And you have to ask yourself if these individuals really should be in the Labour Party. Because quite honestly, the way in which they've used their platform as an MP to actually go against the leader of the Labour Party shows just how out of touch they are with reality. And when we come on to thinking about how this Brexit conundrum is going to be solved, we once again have this split between the left and the right and the centre. But the thing that annoys me more than anything in this is that we have people who say they are Labour MPs, yet they want to actually get rid of. There's 158 MPs, Labour MPs, in vote leave areas. There is 88 Labour MPs in voting remain areas. Some MPs want to actually take the view that we don't respect the referendum result, and we go against that. And they are quite prepared, these MPs, because they're so deluded in the way they are thinking, that they are prepared to lose a good amount of those 158 MPs to prove their point. And that is a disaster, an utter disaster for the Labour Party if they are allowed to do this. And it's about the language which they use. And it comes from both sides of the argument, whether you're a Leave voter or a Remain voter. Both Remain ultras and Leave ultras, they both use the demonisation of their respective voters that they're against. The Leave voters, the ultras, will demonise the Remain voting people, saying, "Look at you, you're a disgrace. You're not. Don't believe in democracy." And yet the Remain ultras are saying, all these Leave voters are thick. They don't know what they're talking about. We know better than you. And this language which is being used towards these two different people shows how broken this society is at the moment. Because the language which we use, instead of being compassionate and thinking about the whole 100% of the people of this country, rather than 52 or 48%, shows how tribal these two parts have become. They're not thinking about the fact that we've got 4.5 million children in poverty. We've got 1 million people using food banks. The NHS in crisis, social care in crisis. We've got a climate emergency. We've got a housing crisis. We've got 0 hours contracts. And the language which is used around these areas has become increasingly, how can I put this, increasingly disrespectful for people who are the most disadvantaged in our society. We once again see people using, these people who are unemployed are work shy and they're disgraced, they just want everything for nothing. The way in which people in this country have descended on people with disabilities and caused them no end of suffering for no good reason. And the way in which people have linked their own personal circumstances to people who are from different cultures, who are the backbone of the NHS, they're the backbone of the care system in this country. People from all over the world who have come here to make this place their home, to take a full part in our society, to pay their taxes, to enrich our country. And yet we have people demonising these people for no good reason. And so the language that we use on a day-to-day basis within our media, it has got to stop. We have got to get back to civility. It's quite an old word really, but civility. Have respect for one another. My view may not be your view, but I will respect your view if you respect my view. We've got, none of us can think the same. We may be on the left or the right, or we may be on the centre, but let's get back to a way of talking about our differences, which doesn't impact on other people in the way in that we demonise people. The worst we can do is to create more and more division with our society. And we know that, going back to this Brexit conundrum we've got, if we don't start thinking about the whole of our society, those people who voted Leave, for instance, they're some of the most deprived areas in the country. They've had very little investment. They do not see a future for their children, their children's future as well, simply because they've been ignored. And if we do not actually do something to help those people, they could turn to the very far right, the thugs in our society who want to destabilise the way we do things in this country, the far right, the EDL, people such as them who've got no interest whatsoever in how to help those people who need it most. They just see that as a fertile ground to go in there and talk about how the establishment has failed them, and they don't, and they should come to their side because they all represent them. I don't want people being represented by the EDL. Whether you can vote Conservative or Labour or Liberal Democrat or whatever, we should not be allowing those people to go into our communities and to turn them against decent people, especially people who've emigrated to this country and found a home here and paid taxes here and take full part in our society. We should not give them the freedom to do that. And if we still continue down this path of treating people and demonizing people because they voted a certain way, or they didn't vote, or whatever, for whatever reason, we're on a very downward slope here. And so the name calling and the way in which certain people in our government and our press and even members of the Labour Party have treated the leader of the opposition and calling him an existential threat to this country. They are absolutely disgraceful. They should take a long, hard look at themselves, because Jeremy Corbyn did not vote for the invasion of Iraq. Jeremy Corbyn wanted peace between Israel and Palestine. Jeremy Corbyn wants to see people come together, because together we're a better society, we're a caring society, and when people come together we can do marvellous things. Those people that want to divide us, whether they're on the centrist part of whether on the right wing, even on the left wing, who feel that they have the only answer. And the only answer we have is to be respectful of people's views and opinions, of those we do not like, of those we disagree with, whether you're a Conservative voter, Labour voter, Liberal Dem voter, or whatever. We can disagree without making it personalised. And that's what's happening at the moment. We are personalising things. And that's wrong. By all means, if Jeremy Hunt criticises Labour policy, then that's fine. We can criticise Jeremy Hunt's foreign policy decisions. But don't go in there. We don't want Jeremy Hunt actually calling Jeremy Corbyn things which he can't substantiate. Because Jeremy Corbyn, all he said was, before we start a war, let's make sure that our evidence is good. And that should be the basis for anything, because our evidence was not good in the war in Iraq, because we all know that was a dodgy dossier. And that was under a Labour government. Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell are both responsible for that. And some of the people still in Parliament today who are against Jeremy Corbyn voted for that war. So let's not take any lessons from those people who then criticise Jeremy Corbyn, because all he wants is to see the evidence. That's all I ask for people to do, is before you throw your hat into the ring with a certain group of people, ask the questions. What's your evidence about this? What do you want to do? And why are we doing it? We all know that if Iran didn't have oil, America wouldn't be interested in it. America basically has a problem. It's addicted to oil. And if this was a patient with a heroin addiction, we'd want them to go to rehab, to get over the addiction, to have a decent life, to be a good member of society again. But America doesn't want that. They don't want to be a good member of the public. They don't want to take a full part in our society, because they're so wedded to oil and the addiction is so strong that if you've got oil, they'll come for you. And that's the problem we've got at the moment. We're not being told the whole truth. and things are being represented in the media, which is all about language. And then whether it's the BBC or the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or the Guardian or ITV or Channel 4, whatever it may be, the language which we use to explain things has gone. Because too many people in the media are just taking whatever somebody says as gospel and saying, oh, he said that, so that must be true. Rather than saying, okay, he said that, let's look at the other side and see what happens there. And let's try and balance this up and see what is actually happening. And let's have a proper discussion about what's happening. And let's have a discussion not with two people from one side and nobody from another side. Let's have a proper discussion of a person who wants this to happen and a person who doesn't want it to happen. So language and the way in which we use it, to come back to this part about politics and how nasty it's become. It's become nasty because we've got to fill a 24-hour news cycle. It's become nasty because instead of papers, who are predominantly using websites for their publications now, as opposed to printed press, they've got so much space to fill that rather than having a proper discussion and giving accurate information and letting the person, or I should say the reader, decide about exactly what they feel about that particular issue, they're being told what the issue is. Now, if you want an editorial and you're on the left or the right or whichever way you are, and your paper is on those areas of policy, then by all means have an editorial, but don't put it within the normal reporting on the pages. Have a clear, concise layout about the issue and saying, this is what's happened. We don't know what the evidence is at the moment, but this is what's been reported. And let people make their minds up. If you want to have your say in a certain way, whichever party you support, then have it in an editorial, but don't put it in the main body of the newspaper. So our language that we use towards one another reflects our society at the moment. And we have to bring people together. There is no way in which we can continue the way we are. And that may mean that somebody's going to be disappointed. But we have to recognise, first thing we have to do is recognise the referendum result. We have to go through this referendum result. We have to implement it. Which doesn't mean a no-deal Brexit. It means a deal. We leave with a deal. We get it done. We get it sorted. And we go back to normal politics. And because we go back to normal politics, we can then discuss the big issues, the bigger issues. Because Brexit and all this upheaval, it only interests those around London and the mainstream media. Everyone else in the country has moved on. So let's move on. And let's look at things like the National Health Service, crime, education, disability, social care, mental health, and let's for once get back to dealing with the structural inequalities within our society. Because unless we do that, our society is broken, and no one will have any confidence in our politicians ever again. And I do realise that those people on the Remain voters may not like what I've just said. But, you know, when I voted in the referendum, I voted, and I was willing to take whatever the outcome of that vote was. And so should you. Because it's important that democracy wins. And that's the only thing we've got, is democracy. And it's time that people grew up and thought about the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is the cohesiveness of our society and the way we treat one another. And that's far more important than Brexit.
Let's show our viewers this article. It was called "The Hard Left Aren't Rebels, They're Just Plain Nasty." This was your column yesterday. Why did you write it?
Oh, I mean, that's the question every columnist is excited to answer. I wrote it in light of a Glastonbury act called Kildren, who had been disinvited from Glastonbury over lyrics or a song called "Kill a Tory," and there had been a sort of on Facebook staging of a kind of scene of killing Jacob Rees-Mogg's kids and so on and so forth. So then, you know, members of the Joe Cox Foundation sort of pointed out this was a very troubling, problematic kind of thing, and Glastonbury responded by disinviting the act. So to me, it was just an opportunity to think about the kind of ways in which the hard left mobilizes certain extremely kind of vitriolic and just downright kind of wrong and can be offensive language. But actually, I've my view about this particular thing is that kind of political, incitement to violence or incitement to hate speech, that's its own thing. I think in the context of Glastonbury, actually it was a mistake. I think that this is actually about free speech. And I think that probably those who have listened to this band would realize that this is not this is not incitement. This is a sort of cartoonish punk rock act. So actually, I actually don't think they should have been kind of disinvited. But I do think it was an opportunity for thinking about the way words like fascist, white supremacist, even Tory scum. But obviously that's a kind of long. That's not so bad. But these become sort of casually thrown around, and it's a serious problem on both sides, the hard left and the hard right, the kind of emptying out of language as we get more and more extreme.
Well, let's get Ash to answer on the hard left aren't rebels. They're just plain. No, I'm not getting you to answer the claim that the hard left aren't rebels. They're just plain nasty. Are these terms just bandied about too easily, and in a way they just lose their meaning?
I mean, I don't think that every use of the word fascist or every use of the word white supremacist is accurate. And that's because not everyone using these terms has necessarily gone back and read Roger Griffin's On the Origins of Fascism. Politics, because it is a public art, language is utilised imprecisely. For me, the issue is about violent language and the real-life consequences that violent language has. Violent language isn't something which is unique to the left. George Osborne said that he was going to chop up Theresa May and put body parts in the freezer. John McTernan, who's an old mate of yours, said that politics is a contact sport, wrote quite approvingly of tales of Labour whips shoving people up against the wall and, twisting their genitals.
Let's take your point then about whether it actually leads to violence in real life. Let's just show this clip from last week's anti-Trump protest in Parliament Square. This is where a Trump supporter is being abused and attacked by the crowd around him. is that sort of behaviour acceptable? I mean, is it acceptable to use the phrase Nazi scum against someone who supports Donald Trump?
I mean, I don't think it was accurate, and I also think that throwing a milkshake at a political activist who hasn't done you directly any harm is a bad thing. I think those things are not good for political discourse. What I would say, though, is having been on the receiving end of a lot of far-right harassment, is that there is a difference between how the left have carried on, which is sometimes, I think, occasionally obnoxious, and how the far right have carried on, which is very violent indeed. And the reason why I say that is because I receive more death threats and racist abuse than I can even keep up with. About a year ago, I was sent an email by a CNN journalist who said to me, "Oh, have you seen these death threats against you?" And I was like, "No." And it turned out to be from the same guy who sent pipe bombs to Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Robert De Niro. The difference between some of the more obnoxious elements of the far left and the organised elements of the far right is that the far left will call names and they'll throw a milkshake. The far right, they want people dead.
So I think the difference is, I think you're absolutely right. The far right has a much more kind of, well, has a history of real kind of terrifying violence. I mean, look at Germany in the 1930s and 40s, and sort of skinheads and stuff. But for me, the issue isn't about what people are doing on the extremes, which reasonable people like us aren't going to be wanting to engage with. It's about what's happening in sort of so-called polite society or the mainstream. And to my view, the left has been much better at colonizing the kind of reasonable domain and helping to destroy a centre ground in ways that the kind of middle of the road right simply hasn't done. It made it unacceptable.
But we can measure these things. We can measure these things in terms of news coverage. We can look at the language of crush the saboteurs, of calling judges enemies of the people. Those are from
But doesn't that reinforce the point that it's happening in supposedly acceptable circles?
But what I'm saying is that it's not merely a creature of the left. I think what it reflects is a polarised political landscape, and that's got very little to do, I think, with the existence of social media and la-la-la. I think what it's down to is the fact that politics itself is polarised because we are in a time of economic crisis, of social crisis, and our political language reflects that.
I've always thought the politics of the left is more nasty than the politics of the right. And I'm bracketing off the far right. Let's disregard them and let's all agree they're vicious and horrendous. So by the right and the left, I mean the mainstream right and left. And I've always found, as a participant on the left, I've always found it to be nastier precisely because there's more doctrine on the left, there's more beliefs, there's a sense of moral righteousness as though you're doing something superior, which you don't have on the right. And that leads to fallouts of a much nastier kind. And that's amongst people of deep mainstream politicians. So I do feel that the atmosphere on the right and left are really very different.
And the issue of who has power, and the sort of, the left has had a problem with power in recent decades, really, apart from Blair.
People feel justified morally in making a point very viciously and nastily on the left. I mean, I've been involved in it a lot, and I don't get the sense, and Kwasi will tell me, that on the right in the Tory party is quite like that.
What about Zach Goldsmith's campaign to be London mayor and the way in which an article that he wrote in the Evening Standard really quite deliberately links Sadiq Khan to terrorist attacks? What I'm saying is that the presentation of your political opponents as some kind of existential threat in highly fraught, high-stakes language, that's not a creature of the left. So, it's everywhere in politics, and it's fairly continuous throughout history, right, particularly at times of crisis.
But is it acceptable then, Kwasi, sorry to interrupt, for Matthew Hancock, who is standing to be leader, to say, as he did last week, that if Jeremy Corbyn came to power, we would end up with the first anti-Semitic leader of a Western nation since the Second World War? If we're talking about political discourse in those sorts of circles.
Yes, I don't think what Matt said was strictly right. I don't think he said that. I think
you do?
No, I think the main point should not have been personalised. I think it's a broader point about anti-Semitism within Corbyn's Labour Party. I think you should always be very careful about questioning actual individuals' motives. There's clearly an issue in the party, but I think I wouldn't have gone so far as to say that Corbyn himself was an anti-Semite.
Well, speaking as a Jewish person who often finds their kind of people in their normal social circle or whatever rolling their eyes at suggestions that there is, there's not just anti-Semitism, but that people allowing the anti-Semitism to happen are anti-Semitic. That is met with a kind of, the Jews making a fuss again kind of thing. I think like at the end of the day, who is doing the anti-Semitism if it's not people who are anti-Semitic? I mean, you can't divorce all the reams and reams and reams of anti-Semitic things that have gone on under Corbyn's watch from Corbyn himself.
In the interest of fair-mindedness, we've had an issue with Islamophobia, but I would never accuse Theresa May of being an Islamophobe. And I think that I would distinguish, even in Corbyn's case, what's going on within his party from making direct accusations about him. That's just that would be my personal approach to that.
Right, I mean, Ash, to come back on that, to what Phil said, that on the left there is a sort of moral, virtuous nature to saying that if you're on the left, you can never be racist. There is a feeling that somehow, whatever you say and whatever you do, that if you're on the left and therefore have fought against fascism and been against the right, that racism isn't part of your DNA.
I mean, I think that worldview has been a problem when it's come to tackling racism on the left, not just within the Labour Party, but within leftist circles more generally. But I think this picture that we're painting here of left-wing political culture being something which is very top-down, very hierarchical, doesn't like the idea of internal criticism at all, just doesn't fit with my experience of it at all. You go to events organised by, say, the World Transformed, and there's a really rich culture of self-criticism, of questioning some of the accepted norms and lines. And I think that that's not the face of the left that you see presented in mainstream media, and that's a problem.
I mean, there is a sort of hierarchy, this sort of, it seems, of hierarchy of racism or abuse that people feel they need to claim. I'm just going to interrupt because we've been sent this tweet and pictures apparently from the Esther McVey. It's not the official launch of Esther McVey for the leadership, but Peter Walker has tweeted odd scenes and very angry man, the one in the white shirt, runs to the podium after McVey has spoken to denounce everyone as fake news. He's hugely angry, but it's not at all clear why. He eventually leaves. I mean, we are seeing more of this sort of thing. And is it about the divisions that you talked about social, but also related to Brexit, or is it more than that?
I think Ash makes a point. I think the specific time we're in is very polarised. There's no question. The referendum is naturally polarising. It's one question or the other. And the other thing that we haven't mentioned is the fact that we've said that, yes, this happens on the left, but you've got a left-wing leader in Jeremy Corbyn, who is ideological. I mean, John McDonnell does read Marx. He does take that stuff seriously. And I think there are lots of people on the left who feel that their brand of socialism or their brand of social democracy is under threat. So there's a very contentious
But then is it
left
responsible, though, that Boris Johnson, the man you want to be Prime Minister, has previously compared the EU with Nazi Germany's plans to create a united Europe? I mean, is that a comparison he should be making, using Nazism in that way?
I wouldn't have used that comparison. But then again, I'm not paid huge amounts to be a writer in a newspaper. I mean,
that's an excuse.
He's a brilliant journalist.
Yeah.
He's written over the last 25 years.
But I think this is
all sorts of things.
I think this is sort of the problem of having this discussion, is that all of us want to point to the other side.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, the hierarchy of
and say, you know, it's you lot who are ratcheting up tensions, it's you lot who are driving polarisations, whereas actually I think these are reflective of deeper political divisions. And the fact is that we always want to castigate the other side for using the same tricks that we're quite happy to employ ourselves.
But has it gone up? I mean, Boris Johnson accused the EU of contemplating Nazi-style punishment beatings on Britain in revenge for Brexit because it's provocative.
It's a metaphor.
But is that responsible?